Thanks for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to speak on this important topic. The topic of my presentation is changes in greenhouse gas emissions from beef cattle in Canada. My presentation is essentially based on a paper we recently published on a journal called Animal Production Science. The topic is very much related to my presentation. It is based on a collaborative work between researchers from different institutions. I'm actually here representing 8 researchers, 3 of them from University of Manitoba, most of them from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, Lethbridge Research Center, and 1 researcher from Environment Canada. What is the key message of my presentation? Well, it's actually a good news story about improvements in Canadian beef industry in terms of the environmental footprint of the beef industry over the last 3 decades. What I'm going to cover in the next minutes will be, initially I'm going to talk about what we did and why we did it. And next, I'm trying to cover some issues related to the methods we used. And lastly, I am going to talk about the major findings of our study and what do really those findings mean. And I will also mention a few things we are planning to do. I want to say a few things about the importance of the beef industry. As you know, there are more than 68,000, close to 70,000 beef farms and feedlots here in Canada, and the beef industry is valued at 35 billion worth of dollars worth of sales and goods to the Canadian economy. The industry produces approximately 2% of the world beef, and we are the 5th largest beef exporter in the world. And in 2014 alone, we produced more than 1.4 million tons of beef. Another very important contribution of the industry that we tend to forget is there are more than 50 million acres of pasture land in Canada, and beef producers are stewards for most of those pasture lands. They manage them, they keep them healthy. By doing that, they protect those marginal lands from tillage and erosion. And the pasture lands that are managed by the beef produce also remove carbon from the atmosphere and store it in the soil. That is what we call carbon sequestration. Those pasture lands also provide habitat for multitude of creatures, and they promote biodiversity. And another interesting thing is beef cattle are incredible tools in that they turn inedible forages, inedible grasses into high-quality protein. How about the prospect of the industry? I took data from the population division of the United Nations to prepare this graph. And according to the report, the recent report, which was released last year, the world population is expected to grow in the coming decades. And most of that growth will be in the less developed regions. Around here, the red line. And in 30 years, the global population, the world population will grow by 30%. This is a predicted value, and it will grow from the current 7 billion to approximately 10 billion. Not only this, the global income, household income, is also predicted to grow, to follow a similar pattern. And as the world's population and wealth increases, so does the global demand for beef, and the Canadian beef industry is expected to play a key role in satisfying the growing demand for beef. What's the challenge? Well, there are many. Most of them were covered in different ways, in different sessions, marketing-related, health-related, feeding-related challenges. But one challenge I would like to mention is there is a growing negative perception about the beef industry. And I believe that this perception will affect the way beef producers are doing their business. It will determine the decisions young producers are making, either to join or to stay in the business. There are a lot of misinformation you can find in the media. These are some of the pictures you may find. And this image is taken from the post that was on the New York Times. It's not local media in rural Manitoba or a small town in Saskatchewan. New York Times has a huge audience, millions of readers, audience every single day. You can see how they try to depict the livestock industry. And there is also a genuine interest, increasing interest, consumer interest in sustainable food production, including beef. More people are now interested to know the environmental footprint of their food, including beef. And more beef producers are looking for science-based information to have the accurate assessment of their production. Not only that, to get the consumer confidence through those science-based information. What did we do? We compared the Canadian beef industry in 1981 to 2011 with regards to greenhouse gases produced, with regards to number of animals and amount of land required to produce the same quantity of beef. Before going to list my major findings and say something about the methods we used, I would like to define a couple of terms so that we all be on the same page. What's carbon footprint? It is a measure of greenhouse gas emissions associated with any human activity, and livestock production is one of them. There are three major greenhouse gases associated with agricultural production: carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. When we say carbon dioxide equivalent, we are trying to say that it is a standard unit used to compare emissions from different greenhouse gases. How we did it? To say a few things about the methodological aspect of our study. After identifying the major parameters, the key parameters we need for the comparative analysis, we extracted those information from several sources, including Census of Agriculture from Statistics Canada, the Canadian Beef Grading Agency, CAMFAX Research Services, producer surveys, and published scientific reports. We gathered information that helps us to do the historical assessment from several sources. Regarding the greenhouse aspect of our study, we determined greenhouse gas emissions associated with beef cattle industry using the life cycle assessment based primarily on a whole farm model that is developed by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, which is called HOLOS. The HOLOS methodologies are actually based on the accepted procedures and intergovernmental panel on climate change. IPCC procedure is currently the global standard to estimate, to determine greenhouse gas emission associated to any human activity. We have estimated hundreds of different parameters just to simplify the major categories of the data types we used in our model. We collected animal-related data from different sources. That includes classes of cattle, numbers for each category of cattle, body weights, carcass weights, and other biological parameters. Not only that, we also determined the feed types used for each cattle category. And we also tried to determine the composition of those common feed types used for different cattle categories. We also determined amount of feed and days on feed for animals in each category. This would be enough to determine enteric methane emission, but we are not only targeting to determine enteric methane emission, we want to determine nitrous oxide emission and carbon dioxide emission. So we estimated land-related parameters, such as amount of land required to produce the feeds used by the cattle, and inputs, fertilizers, pesticides used to produce the feeds, which were used for cattle production. I'll not stay so much on this slide. This was the model system and the system boundary we used for our model. A few things I would like to mention here is we included surplus calves from the dairy system that joined beef operations and different systems. We also considered cull dairy cows. They were basically used for beef production at the end of their life. We also considered them, but we didn't consider veal calves in our analysis. But those two categories from the dairy animal system were considered in our analysis. The input we considered included fertilizers, pesticides, and machines, and the outputs, the major one is beef. There were also undesirable outputs, which were estimated, the methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide. Here you can find the major sources of greenhouse gas emissions for our study. We considered methane emissions from animal and manure. We also determined nitrous oxide emission from manure and soils. And we also estimated energy use emissions or carbon dioxide emissions from cropping, from manual handling, from fertilizer and pesticide production. Now, I would like to move to the major findings of our study. Let me start with the number of animal requirement. To produce the same quantity of beef, let's say 1 billion pounds of beef in Canada today, as compared to 30 years ago, 27 fewer slaughter cattle are required. Similarly, to produce the same quantity of beef in Canada today, as compared to 30 years ago, 29% fewer cattle are required in the breeding herd. Let me show you our finding on land requirement. As you can see on this slide, our finding revealed that 24 5% less land is required today to produce same quantity of beef as compared to 30 years ago. In other words, if you needed 100 acres of land in 1981 to produce a given quantity of beef, you would only need 76 acres of land in 2011. The next finding is greenhouse gas production associated with a production of kilogram of a given quantity of beef, which is also known as carbon footprint. Our study revealed that beef produced in Canada today produces 15% smaller carbon footprint as compared to 30 years ago. In other words, if there are 100 units of greenhouse gases associated with certain amount of beef back in 1981, there would only be 85 units of greenhouse gases in 2011. Let me say something about the contribution of different sources of greenhouse gases to the total emission. As you can see from this pie chart, enteric methane accounted for more than 3/4 of the total emissions associated with a unit of Canadian beef. We all know that methane is the major greenhouse gas from cattle. It is mainly produced during the digestion of feeds in the rumen, and the methane that comes from the digestive system is known as enteric methane, and it contributes for more than 73% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. And the next one is manure nitrous oxide. The main message from this slide is the cow-calf system, which contains cows, replacement heifers, calves, and bulls, accounted for more than 78% of enteric methane emissions from the total system. That means that most of the enteric methane comes from the cow-calf system, and this clearly offers opportunities for mitigation. This graph helps us to see how we are doing as compared to other developed beef production systems. And there was a study in Australia. They compared 1981 and 2010. Another study in US. They did similar analysis. They compared 1977 with 2007. Interestingly, the greenhouse gas intensity, which means greenhouse gas per unit product, declined by 14 to 17% in all the three countries. In terms of absolute value, the greenhouse gas intensity in Canada is lower than Australia. Understandably, more forage is used in Australia, and the cattle are also kept for extended period compared to us. But the overall decline is similar in all the three countries over the 30 years period. That's a good news. The next likely question is, why did these positive changes occur? Well, it's because of multiple factors, but the major one is there have been improvements in the performance of cattle over the past 30 years. These are good examples, and I just selected 4 parameters just to show you how the productive performance of our cattle have improved over the past 30 years. for our analysis, we defined reproductive efficiency as the number of calves weaned per 100 cows exposed. And the reproductive efficiency in 1981 was 74. Now, it's 85%. The weaning weight of calves in 1981 was 219. It's now 263. Let me show you the percentage change for the same parameters. This graph shows the percentage change from 1981 to 2011. The reproductive efficiency of cows in 2011 was 15% higher than those in 1981. And at weaning, calves in 2011 were 20% heavier than calves back in 1981. Slaughter weight for steers were also higher by 29% in 2011. More remarkably, the heifer slaughter weight were up by 45% in 2011 as compared to 1981. That's a huge, huge improvement. The improvements were not only in the performance of cattle, but there were also improvements in the feed aspect of, in the feed production aspect of our industry. As you can see from this table, the yield per unit area showed significant improvement. Take the corn grain. The dry matter yield for corn grain in 1981 was around 5,000. Back in 2011, it was more than 8,000. I think it's better to visualize the change in graph form. This graph shows percentage change from 1981 to 2011, and the yield, barley grain and barley silage yields in 2011 were 23% higher than that of 1981. For corn grain, it was more remarkable, 61%. 61%. In our modeling, in our analysis, we didn't specifically estimate the effect of growth promoting technologies, but it was very obvious that growth promoting technologies contributed remarkably for those changes we have witnessed in the performance of our cattle. This is, I have taken this values from a recent report by Duckett and Pratt in 2014. They compared the productive performance of the anabolic implanted feedlot cattle with those not implanted with anabolic implants. And the average change was very remarkable. The average daily gain of those cattle, those feedlot cattle implanted were 18% higher, 16% higher for feed intake, 8% for feed efficiency, and the carcass weight of those implanted feedlot cattle were also higher by 5% as compared to the non-implanted cattle. So what are the next steps of our project? As I mentioned at the beginning, greenhouse gases, the environmental impacts of the beef industry are not limited to greenhouse gases. So the next step of our project will be to assess the impact of the Canadian beef production on other sustainability indicators such as water use, air quality, biodiversity, and ecosystem services. You may probably asking yourself, what do the findings of this study mean? To summarize, over the past 3 decades, Canadian beef producers have not only improved production efficiency, but also significantly reduced the carbon footprint per unit beef. And compared to other production systems, the cow-calf system, the cow-calf sector, accounted for most of the methane emissions, and this offers opportunities for mitigations. Yes, we know that feeding grain-based diets reduce methane production as compared to feeding forage-based diets. But as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, the pasture lands that are managed by beef producers have multiple benefits. So the environmental sustainability of the beef industry is a matter of finding a balance between increasing production efficiency, maintaining the benefits of grazing, and reducing the carbon footprint of the industry. Within the cow-calf sector, further reduction of methane production can be possible through improving the quality of forage, selecting and managing animals for improved production and reproduction, and also through growth-promoting technologies. Finally, as Reynold mentioned this morning, considering the growing negative perception of the livestock industry, telling your story is becoming an essential part of the sustainability of the industry. So as beef producers, you need to tell others that you are the caregivers of the animals and you are the stewards of the lands. If you are not telling your story, somebody else will, but you may not like the way they're telling it. Let me show you something before I finalize my presentation. Some of you may remember this. This was a breaking news back in 1981. This was the first PC released by IBM. The IBM PC, it was also known as Acorn. The memory, 16 kilobyte. I have a USB drive. The capacity is 32 gigabyte. Back then, it was a huge breakthrough in the science. And in 2011, I don't want to talk about this. Most of you know about this, the Apply Mac, the capacity, the memory, and everything. There was also another technology that was launched by Ericsson, the Nordic mobile telephony. That was also a huge breaking news. Here we are in 2011 with Apple iPhone 4S, with different capacity, different efficiency. Here is the point I'm trying to make. As some people may think, our gadgets, our computers, our cell phones are not the only things that have become efficient over the years. You need to tell your story that the beef production in Canada has also become more efficient over the past 3 decades, and it leaves a smaller carbon footprint per unit product. And our findings back up your story. Thank you very much. This was the end of my presentation. Here is the list of contributing scientists, 3 of us from University of Manitoba. The principal investigator is Dr. Tim McAllister from Lethbridge Research Center. We would like to acknowledge the funding we received from Beef Cattle Research Council to do our research. Thank you.